I'm Chisgule Gaming, and today we're going to help you make the tankiest march possible in Rise of Kingdoms. Whether you're battling in the open field, doing Ian's Ballads, Ceroli Crisis, or heck, even Golden Kingdom, we're going to help you get some crazy value, making the tankiest team possible to hold the line while the rest of your marches do work. Hello my friends and welcome back. In today's video we're going to be talking about the tankiest combinations of commanders in Rise of Kingdoms. You know I love commander pairings, I know you love commander pairings. Today we're going to break it down, helping you understand what makes a commander tanky in Rise of Kingdoms and what are all the tools available to you to make that march last forever. And we're going to go in and talk about other things you can do to support that march and make it more effective so that you win Canyon and all those other game modes even more than you do today. If you like Rise of Kingdoms guides that help you get value and smash your enemies, consider smashing that subscribe button for daily Rise of Kingdoms videos. We're a sponsored content creator, and you know what's funny? We made a video about this topic over a year ago that was very popular, and we're back again because there's so much that's changed in the game. Before we talk about the combos, there's a few things we need to talk about that make a commander tanky. We're going to talk about, first of all, why you want a tanky commander. Then we're going to talk about the skills, the talents, the specific commanders that we would recommend, and last but not least, the pairs that we think are the very best in Rise of Kingdoms. Now let's talk about why you even want a tanky march in the first place. There are a couple reasons why that is absolutely true, and I'll name just a few game modes. Some of them are obvious. For instance, Ian's Ballads, somebody's got to take the majority of the damage. In Sunset Canyon, you've got to have a march that stands off on its own because, look, you can have 4 marches put together, but then one has to be kind of on its own. Even if you put it down here, the enemy can have 4 marches in their top lane, and so your top lane is going to tank their 4 marches. There's a lot of reasons why you need to be able to have a march that can take a lot of damage to hold the line while your other marches do work. Heck, even these other front marches over here need to be more tanky marches. In game modes like Ceroli Crisis, someone even gets that tank role. There are just so many situations where you might want to have a march that is very tanky. So with that said, what are the things that make a march tanky? And I want to first talk about the skills. There are some skills that make a march last longer. One thing that makes a march last longer is very simply healing. Now, healing is weird in this game in that there isn't really a dedicated healer, with the exception of game modes like Ian's Ballads and Ceroli Crisis, where there actually now is a healer role. Richard I is really the only commander in the game whose primary function is tanking and healing. Now, the healing comes in the form of a healing active skill. However, he also is reducing the damage of the enemy, which is very powerful as an effect. Another thing that is similar to healing, but doesn't actually restore troops, but it's got a very similar effect, is shielding. Charles Martel, as an example, has a really solid shield. He is going to make it so that instead of losing troops for some period of time, you instead have damage done to your shield, and once the shield goes away, you then start having losses to your army again. That is very solid in improving the tankiness of a march. In addition, I really like damage taken reduction. Not a coincidence, this also happens to be on Richard I. It reduces damage taken by 15%, which is really quite remarkable for a single commander. In fact, his expertise gives you another 5% damage taken reduction. There are other commanders that reduce damage taken as well. I do want to talk about some of those other ways of reducing damage taken. For instance, if you get a look at Saladin, he's got both of those additional ways of sort of reducing your damage taken into a single skill, reducing counterattack damage and skill damage taken. Very solid. You also can reduce normal attack damage taken. I believe that that is on Takeda. Doesn't really matter exactly who's got these sorts of things. Reducing the damage you take is a way to profoundly improve your tankiness, especially when you combine it with healing and a few other things. Those other things include defensive stats. Defensive stats make a commander much more tanky. Those defensive stats include things like health and defense. Health and defense, not a coincidence, happen to be on Charles Martel. Part of the reason he's a very tanky commander in this game. Health, we've proven in other videos, is arguably the most efficient stat, if not the best stat in Rise of Kingdoms. I'll put a card up in the top. The moral of that story is that the more you have of a stat point, the less each additional point will give you in terms of benefit. And in game modes like Ark of Osiris, you're going to have a buff that gives like 100 or 200% attack, actually. Also, you have Alliance technology that gives attack and defense. Even in Kingdom versus Kingdom, Light versus Darkness, you have things that give you attack and defense, but nothing really gives you health. So health is the stat you're likely to have the lowest. Getting more of that stat is going to give you an incrementally better benefit than other stats. Another way that you can make a march more tanky is by disrupting what the enemy is doing. Reducing their damage, reducing their attack, or even making it so that you reduce the rage that they generate, or even silence them and reduce their ability to fire off active skills. It's not a coincidence that I argue that Herman is one of the better free-to-play commanders for battling T5s and being disruptive in the open field. I'll put a card up in the top for my free-to-play commander pairings I'd recommend to take on a T5 player. You've got to have a group of non-T5s to do it, but that's what I would recommend for marches. He's reducing the rage of the target, so they're not getting their active skills as much, and he silences the target. Another example of a commander that has a lot of disruption is El Cid. These are healing or tanky skills in disguise on their active skill. Disarms the target for 1 second over here, making it so that their normal attacks and also their active skill can't fire off for 1 second. Those are all the ways that you can make a march more tanky with the skills. But now we need to talk about the talents. Now, as you know, only the talents of the primary commander apply when you are going in and pairing two commanders together. And the tree that I want to talk about the most is actually the trees in blue. The blue trees include skill and attack, as well as support and defense. Now, two of these trees are very good for tanking. There's the defense tree. Two of these trees are very good for tanking. Two of them are very good for offense. The offensive trees are the skill tree and the attack tree. The tanky trees are the defense tree and the support tree. These trees actually do some similar things. The attack tree and defense tree are very obviously in different directions for what they're doing. Attack for attacking, defense for tankiness. However, people don't realize that the support tree and the skill tree are very similar. They both generate rage. However, the support tree has a flair for tankiness, and the skill tree has a flair for damage dealing. So you want to use a commander that has either the defense tree or the support tree as a primary commander for your pairing. And that is going to give you the most tankiness. Now, if we get a look at some of these talents, there are a lot of really high leverage talents in those trees that ultimately reduce the damage that you take, sometimes at the expense of the damage that you deal. And that's okay. We're okay with that in this situation. We're trying to reduce the damage we take as much as possible. One talent I've played around with is really Desperate Elegy. I don't want to go too in-depth on this one. It gives you a burst when you get lower. It's cool, but doesn't inherently improve your tankiness. Things that do inherently improve your tankiness are no weakness, reducing damage taken, loose formation, reducing skill damage taken, and so on. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about healing in the context of making a tanky march, because when you're battling against the computer, right? Like you're doing Golden Kingdom, or you're doing something like Ian's Ballads. The fact that healing is something that other commanders can disrupt and mess up is not going to be a concern, because you're battling against the computer. You're not fighting against a human who will counter what you're doing specifically. But if you are against a human who is countering what you're doing, healing effects for tankiness really lose a lot of their effectiveness. We've got many commanders that now counter healing. That includes Ramses, Alexander the Great, Saladin. They'll probably do more at some point. I mention that because I generally wouldn't steer you toward healing, with the exception of this talent over here, Medicinal Supplies, which is giving you a little bit of healing every time you use an active skill. I think this is a solid amount of points that you're committing for a pretty reasonable gain to your tankiness, getting a little bit of supplemental healing. If they counter it, not the end of the world. If they don't counter it, huzzah, the healing is actually very, very good. Now, just getting a quick look into the support tree to talk about it very, very briefly. There are obviously a lot of talents I like to generate rage in the top part of the tree. However, your tankiness comes in the bottom part of the tree, reducing the skill damage you take and making it so there's a 50% chance you gain an additional skill damage reduction after you take skill damage. Very good if you're getting hit by lots of enemies. Now, there are, of course, other things that can make you more tanky. In the infantry tree, I really like health. There are other things in here as well. What I will call your attention to in this video, since I'm not going to do specific builds here, is that if you're making a tanky march that doesn't have to go anywhere, you typically want to avoid things like march speed in favor of getting raw stats and horsepower. To give an example, actually, of one build I actively use for this purpose, you know, my Richard I is rocking a canyon build here. I've removed almost everything that would give me march speed in favor of things that give me raw stats. And if you're tanking, that is often what you want to do. The only exception is in fights like maybe Ceroli Crisis when you're fighting Kira and you need to run around to get into the bubble shield to get protection. Then you might want or need some march speed, but otherwise you don't need it in Canyon. You don't need it in Ballads. There's a lot of reason you would just avoid it entirely for raw stat gain. Now let's talk about the commanders that I think are really good for making a tanky march in Rise of Kingdoms. And I'm going to start with some honorable mentions. And you might be surprised by some of these. The first honorable mention is Alexander the Great. Although he does do shielding, the majority of his stats are really not defensive. And although he does make it so that you are immune to damage reduction effects, that's not really helping you tank. So I think he's a fine choice, in fact, a phenomenal choice in the open field, but not a particularly tanky commander. In addition, I'll say that Ethelfled is not a particularly tanky commander, but is an honorable mention. She doesn't have really any skills that are particularly making her tanky, but her talents in the support tree are really quite exceptional in that regard. And so she gets an honorable mention here. I've used her in the front row just because of all of this skill damage reduction. It's very, very effective. And also healing herbs does improve your healing effectiveness. The next honorable mention might kind of shock you, and that is Ramses. Ramses has a defense bonus that is astonishingly high, and he also heals. He is remarkably tanky, I have found, and really adds a lot of longevity to archers. He also has skill damage taken reduction. He is deceptively tanky and is worthy of an honorable mention, and maybe even would be considered a tanky commander. Quite frankly, maybe he should make the list. The next commander I'm going to give an honorable mention to is going to be Julius Caesar. He improves your defense by a small amount with his active skill, and this second skill reduces damage taken on average by about 19% overall, which is a pretty massive damage taken reduction. Very solid as a commander, also letting you bring more troops to the battlefield. Having more troops gives you a lot of leverage. It makes it so that damage factor related abilities do more damage or more healing. It is very powerful to bring more troops, and 15% is no joke. The final honorable mention here is going to be Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is a phenomenal commander all around. He does give 10% infantry health, very tanky when you bring infantry, and 10% damage taken reduction. Doesn't even care about the troop type. He is only a little bit tanky though. The majority of his kit is geared toward dealing damage. This is true from the skill tree and also from having only one skill that is actually contributing to your tankiness. If he had the support tree, I mean, it'd be insane, but also then I think he would be a very tanky commander. I'll also give a quick shout out to Joan of Arc. Her support tree does make her a viable frontline commander in a lot of pairings, and also she does have a tiny amount of healing. If you are bringing all cavalry or infantry, you are going to get either the health or defense bonus from her active skill, so it does make her a little bit more tanky, although not really. I found that when looking at having her as the primary or a commander like Richard I as the primary, that Richard I primary with Joan of Arc secondary was a better pick. I was very surprised by that. I thought the support tree was going to be better, and really it wasn't. The defense tree was better. So I think she is an honorable mention, but not worthy of a top tier tanking commander. Now let's get into those top tier tanking commanders, and the first one we're going to mention, which you might find somewhat surprising, is going to be Scipio. Scipio is a very solid tanky commander in Rise of Kingdoms. If you're making a tank pair, you might want to consider including Scipio in that pairing. I use him on the front line in my restart project, and there is really a lot to like about Scipio in this capacity. First and foremost, his active skill is reducing damage taken by 25%. That is massive. In addition, he's giving himself 25% counterattack, which, okay, a tanky commander doesn't necessarily need to deal lots of damage, but if you have lots of marches hitting you, you're going to get a lot of damage dealt to every single one of those marches from your boosted counterattack. It's very powerful. This next skill is going to give you a chance of dealing extra damage when you get low, but in addition, there's healing here. And you know I like that combination of healing and damage taken reduction. In addition, he lets you bring more troops, which is very powerful for all of your damage factor, healing factor related effects. Heck, even your normal attacks and counterattacks are going to do more damage when you have more troops. I think Scipio is a very solid pick, and his biggest downfall has historically been his profound lack of march speed from both the attack and leadership trees. In fact, unfortunately, the attack tree is not quite so good for tanking. This is the build I would recommend for most players, using Scipio as a tanky commander if he is the primary. And for the most part, I think he really should be the secondary commander. Using him as the secondary commander lets you get a higher leverage support commander as the primary. Even an Ethelflaed with a Scipio primary, I think would be better than flipping that the other way around. And you will get a lot of value with this commander on the battlefield. If he is the primary, do make sure you get armored joints to reduce the damage taken by 1.5%. That is a very powerful effect. If you are going all in on tankiness, you could go in for Buckler Shield, and that would be a pretty reasonable pickup. In fact, here is a version of that same build I was just talking about, a little more tanky. A little more tanky. You are losing, honestly, a lot of attack when you get weak. However, your upside here is reducing the counterattack damage you take all the time. There's pros and cons to this. I've got 5 points remaining for this build. You could put those into health. You could put those into the normal damage dealt. I generally think if you're bringing 3 different troop types, that Armed to the Teeth is probably the better pick, even though it's not a tanky stat. It is improving the damage you deal, and I think that's worth it here. If I was just going to throw down these 2 points, I would probably just put them into Steely Soul and call it a day. For raw tankiness, yes, you probably would go for things like health and defense instead of attack and normal attack damage. Now, the next commander I want to talk about, you might find somewhat surprising. It's a cavalry commander, and that commander is Takeda. Takeda is astonishingly tanky. He is giving you a massive defense bonus of 40%. In addition, you get a healing factor of 150 over the course of 4 seconds. So that's a very solid amount of healing. It happens every time the active skill is used. He's also reducing the skill damage taken, the normal attack damage taken, the counterattack damage taken. It is astonishing how tanky Takeda is. Unfortunately, his talents really don't lend him to being a good primary commander. He's a good secondary commander. He's a great secondary for Joan of Arc, if you can believe it. I use Joan of Arc, Takeda as a pairing, and they are ridiculously tanky in Canyon. However, the commander I want to mention as one of my top tanky commanders is going to be Saladin. Saladin and Takeda are honestly astonishingly tanky and survivable. When Saladin came into the game, I said the thing he really wanted was a commander that could do some healing, because he reduces the damage he takes so effectively, not only from his skills, which he does very elegantly, but also from his talents. You get a look over here, and there are so many talents you can take. First of all, Loose Formation reduces skill damage taken. You could get Emergency Protection, which does even more of that for you. Also, Emblazoned Shield reduces damage taken. Heck, Disarm is reducing the attack of the enemy. Very, very tanky ability. You can reduce the counterattack damage that you're taking even further. This is the build I use right now, and you could make an argument that I should get Undying Fury. That would be a fair argument. But this build is very tanky, and I have found a lot of value with Saladin Takeda as a tanky pair. They are very maneuverable. However, they really miss on some of that high impact, short window of time punch that you need in the open field. But as a frontline tanky march in game modes like Canyon, where you don't have to go anywhere, yeah, you can use them and they'll do well. Even Saladin and Joan of Arc as a frontline march is something that I have used because Saladin as a primary is so good in that way. Saladin and Takeda or Joan of Arc, very tanky. I can recommend those commanders and pairs very highly. The next commanders that I've got for you are all infantry commanders, and it's worth just mentioning for a moment, I haven't talked much about troop type. I'm not too worried about the type of troop that you bring. I'm more concerned about the abilities on the commanders to make sure that they are tanky with those abilities, both skills and talents. The first commander I want to mention for infantry is Constantine. The dude is a beast. He reduces the attack of the enemy. He gives all nearby marches that are friendly a damage taken reduction effect of 10%, which is massive. He gives 40% health, which is the best stat in Rise of Kingdoms. He's giving additional attack, solid, but more importantly, that's paired with normal attack damage taken reduction from cavalry, which is really quite good. A lot of people bring cavalry into a bunch of game modes. In addition, he's got a huge burst healed whenever you get below 50%, and that happens once per fight when you leave your city. And also, after you've popped that shield, your healing effectiveness is actually reduced. So you might not want to pair him with a commander like Richard I, but the skill damage taken reduction is elevated by 40% every time a shield goes off. So commanders like Alexander the Great, which give shields, give a little extra boost. He's also giving all troop types 5% defense. That's a nice little boost as well. He's got the support tree and the infantry tree. This commander can be super tanky. The next infantry commander I want to talk about is Charles Martel. His active skill is a shield. I really like this because it can't be countered by healing reduction effects. He gives defense, he gives health, and on top of that, he's got a ton of counterattack. I really like Charles Martel. The defense tree is solid as heck. Use this commander for sure in a tanky march. The next, of course, mention here is Richard I. Healing, damage reduction to the enemy, march speed reduction. Heck, you even have counterattack damage boost, damage taken reduction. We've got infantry defense, healing effectiveness boosts. I mean, this commander does it all. Infantry tree, defense tree. Richard I is a solid tanking commander, and yeah, pretty much everybody should be thinking about having this commander in their roster at ideally 5-5-1-1 or better. Now, when we think about pairs of commanders, I'm just going to mention a few because I've given you all of the building blocks that you need to make some really, really solid tanking pairs. And I'm going to try to put them in order, but this is not going to be perfect. At the bottom of the list for me is going to be pairings with Scipio. Scipio's good. Scipio's good, but he's not legendary. And I think you can do a little bit better. Things like Ethelfled, Scipio are really great early to mid-game picks. Heck, even pretty far in on my restart project, I'm using that Ethelfled Scipio combination, and it is performing very admirably for me. I can recommend it very highly. Up next, I'm going to say the Saladin Joan of Arc pair is really quite exceptional. I think it works very, very well, and I used that for a long time. In addition, Saladin Takeda are exceptionally tanky, as well as Joan of Arc Takeda, working very well as a frontline tanky march. Right now, I'm using that Joan of Arc with Takeda, and it is doing some serious work. Now, when we get to infantry pairings, I'm going to argue that any of these three infantry commanders that we mentioned, Constantine, Richard I, or Charles Martel, make a really great pick. If you're battling against other players, you really need to be concerned about the effect to which Richard can be countered for his healing. He really can be. So I would steer you towards probably the Charles Martel Constantine pick for a tanky pair that can't really be countered, has a lot of tankiness, a lot of healing, and heck, even the shield effectiveness is boosted once you get below that 50% threshold from the Constantine. Very, very tanky solid pair. I of course need to give a mention, however, to the Richard I and Charles Martel pairing. I personally still use this. I still use this 660 days into Rise of Kingdoms as an off-lane tanking pair, or to dominate, truly dominate, a game mode like Golden Kingdom. This pair has served me very well for a very long time. Richard I, definitely worth universals. Charles Martel, wait until you're close to expertising before you start firing off those universals. Card up in the top if you want to see why. You don't want to use universals on gold key commanders. Now look, I might have forgot something when I made this list, so leave a comment down below with what you think some of the tankiest pairs are in the game. There is potentially an honorable mention that needs to be made for Ramses with Edward. That might be a thing. It's a little weird, but it's very tanky. But you know what? Leave it down below in the comments. Throw a like on the video if you found this helpful. And if you're looking for more videos, you could certainly check out the video we talked about earlier that we made. Gosh, it was like over a year ago, I think, for tanky pairs for battling PvE specifically, right? So if you're using a Peacekeeper as the primary, Lohar is a pretty neat Peacekeeper to use as a primary. Works very well for tanking with like a Richard I secondary. And if you're looking for more free-to-play pairings, I'll put a card up in the top. You can check that out. In fact, maybe I'll put 2 cards if I still have room for them for free-to-play combinations that might get you some serious value in Rise of Kingdoms. Throw a like on the video if you enjoyed this. And until next time, my friends, you have fun smashing the kingdom.